When I was a kid, there was a rumor about a woman who vanished from our lake in the summer of 1978. Last year, I found an old photograph that turned that rumor into something much bigger and much closer to me than I ever imagined. It led me to a stranger in Chicago, and to the truth about my father I was never meant to know. I'd been helping my dad clear out the attic last winter when I found it, a thick, leather-bound Bible wedged between a box of Christmas lights and an old shoebox full of VHS tapes. The cover was cracked and smelled faintly of cedar, the kind of scent that makes you think of church basements and wooden pews. When I opened it, a folded yellow envelope slid out. My name wasn't on it, instead it just said, "For the day you're ready." Inside was a letter written in my dad's handwriting, but it was dated June 17, 1975. The problem? In 1975 my dad would have been 18, and I didn't think he was the type to write letters to himself, let alone hide them for decades. The letter started, "If you're reading this, it means you've found the Bible. And if you've found the Bible, you need to know the truth about what happened the summer I turned 18. The handwriting was younger, more hurried, like he'd written it in one sitting. "It was the summer after graduation," the letter said. "Your grandmother had me working double shifts at the gas station to save for college, but all I could think about was getting out of town. Back then, our little Ohio town felt like the center of nowhere. Same diner, same faces, same conversations. I wanted something big to happen, and it did." He described how, one June evening, a beat-up blue VW van rolled into the station. It had out-of-state plates and smelled faintly of patchouli and campfire. Inside were three strangers, two guys with shaggy hair and a girl who looked like she'd stepped right out of a Fleetwood Mac album cover. Her name was Claire. She had a camera hanging around her neck and this easy laugh that made even the older mechanics look over. They were driving cross-country, taking photos for some art project, and the van needed a quick fix. "I told them I could have it ready in the morning," Dad wrote, and Claire said, "Then we'll stick around. Show us what's fun in this town." He admitted he'd never met anyone like her, someone who made the local bowling alley feel like the most exciting place on earth. "I thought they'd leave the next day," the letter continued, "but that wasn't the plan. Not theirs and not mine. The morning the van was ready, I expected them to be gone before I even clocked in," Dad wrote. "But when I opened the shop, Claire was sitting on the curb, sipping a Coke from the vending machine. She said the others had taken a bus to Cleveland for a few days, and she decided to stay. That didn't make much sense. Why would someone on a tight cross-country schedule just hang around a dusty Ohio town?" Dad said they spent the day wandering. "She wanted to see everything, the old drive-in theater, the train tracks where kids used to sneak beers, even the little record shop that mostly sold used 8-tracks. She bought a cassette of Rumors by Fleetwood Mac and told him, 'This one's going to last forever.' That night they went to the town fair. Dad described the lights, the smell of fried dough, the sound of Journey's Wheel in the Sky blasting from the tilt-a-whirl speakers. But in between all the music and laughter, Claire started asking strange questions. Did the town always have this many police around? Were there any places to hide out if you needed to? How close was the train station to the highway? I didn't think much of it at the time," Dad wrote, "but looking back, she wasn't just here for fun. It was the third night she was in town when I realized something was off," Dad's letter continued. "Claire had this habit of scanning crowds. Even when they were sitting in the diner eating grilled cheese and fries, her eyes kept flicking to the door every time it opened. She laughed easily, but it was the kind of laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. That night, they were at the old river dock, a place where kids would gather after dark. He brought his dad's beat-up transistor radio, and they sat listening to Casey Kasem's Top 40 countdown while skipping stones across the water. Halfway through Betty Davis' Eyes by Kim Carnes, headlights appeared on the dirt road leading to the dock. Claire's whole body went rigid. She told him, sharply, to turn off the radio and keep still. It wasn't anyone they knew. Just an old Chevy pickup that slowed down, its driver looking out toward the water. When it finally drove off, Claire let out a breath like she'd been holding it for hours. "I should have asked her right then what was going on," Dad wrote. "But I didn't. I was 18 and she was the most interesting thing to happen to me. I didn't want to risk chasing her away with questions." The next day the two guys from the van returned from Cleveland. Dad expected Claire to leave with them, but she didn't. She told them she'd catch up later. They didn't seem surprised. That night, she showed up at the gas station holding a manila envelope. She asked if he could keep it safe for a few days. When he hesitated, she just smiled and said, "It's nothing illegal, but it's important." "I slid it into the bottom drawer of my workbench," Dad wrote. "And I didn't open it. Not then." 2 days passed before I gave in, Dad wrote. It was a slow afternoon at the station, rain coming down in sheets, and I was alone in the shop. That envelope had been burning a hole in my mind since the moment she left it. He described sliding it out of the drawer, half expecting nothing more than postcards or photographs. But inside were a stack of Polaroids, not the friendly kind. They showed a man in his late 40s, dressed in a sharp suit, always looking over his shoulder. Some were taken at night under street lamps, others through what looked like a motel window. In a few, Dad recognized places from Cleveland, the bus depot, a downtown diner. Mixed in with the photos was a single bus ticket stub dated a week earlier, and a folded map with certain routes marked in red pen. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't good, Dad wrote. And for the first time, I wondered if helping Claire meant getting myself into something I couldn't get out of. That night he waited for her at the dock. When she arrived, she was wearing a raincoat and carrying her camera in a plastic bag. He told her he'd looked inside the envelope. She didn't get angry. She just sat on the bench, silent for a while before saying, "That man, he hurt someone I love. I need proof before the police will listen. And if I go back without it, I might not come back at all." Dad said he wanted to help, but she shook her head. "You've already helped by keeping it safe. I'm leaving tonight." That night, she hugged him quickly, like she was afraid she'd lose her nerve if she lingered, and walked toward the highway under the dim orange glow of the streetlights. Dad waited until she disappeared into the darkness before heading home. He never saw her again. For weeks he kept expecting to hear something. A phone call, a postcard, a knock at the door. Nothing came. Then one morning, while reading the local paper over a cup of instant coffee, he saw a small headline buried on page 6. Prominent Cleveland businessman found dead in motel room, no foul play suspected. The article gave few details, just that the man had been in town for personal reasons. No mention of an investigation, no hint of the photos or the bus ticket. But Dad recognized the name immediately. It was the man in Claire's Polaroids. Years passed. Dad went to college, married Mom, and never mentioned Claire. But he never threw away the envelope. He kept it sealed in a shoebox in the back of his closet, as though some part of him still expected her to come back for it. "And now you know why that box was there," the letter concluded. "If you're reading this, I'm gone and you can do what you want with it. But I've always wondered if Claire made it out safe, and if she ever knew I would have followed her anywhere." I set the letter down and just stared at the envelope sitting in front of me. It was still there, just like Dad had described, thick, sealed with brittle tape that looked older than me. My hands were trembling when I peeled it open. The Polaroids were faded now, colors bleeding into that strange sepia of the 1980s. But the man's face was still clear, sharp. The bus ticket was fragile, edges crumbling. And the map, the red ink hadn't faded much at all. For a long time, I just sat there at the kitchen table, rain tapping against the window, wondering what kind of danger Dad had been a heartbeat away from stepping into. That night, I searched the man's name online. Most of what I found matched the article Dad mentioned. Businessman, some shady real estate deals, died in 1986. But there was one forum thread, old, buried deep, where someone hinted his death wasn't as clean as the papers said. And then, buried in the comments, was a sentence that made my chest tighten. I knew Claire. She wasn't the kind of girl you forget. The username was nothing but a jumble of letters, but I clicked anyway. The account was inactive for over a decade. Still, the idea that someone else remembered her, that she'd left a trace, made something in me spark. By the next morning, I'd made up my mind. I was going to find out what happened to Claire. The map was my starting point. It was the kind you used to get free at gas stations, highways in bold red, tiny towns in small black print. Claire's routes were drawn in pen, connecting Cleveland to a few dots along the shore of Lake Erie. One town was circled twice. It wasn't far from where Dad had grown up, so the following weekend I drove out there. The place was barely more than a strip of road with a diner, a bait shop, and a rusted water tower. The kind of town that looked exactly like it had in 1985, just more faded. I took the Polaroids into the diner. The waitress was probably in her 60s, with a name tag that read Eileen. When I slid one of the photos across the counter, she froze. "This is old," she said quietly. "Do you know him?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not him. Her." She tapped the edge of the photo where, in the reflection of a glass door, Claire was just barely visible, a faint silhouette holding her camera. Eileen poured herself a coffee, sat down across from me, and told me she remembered Claire coming through that summer. Said she'd been asking questions about a certain motel near the highway. When I asked if she knew what happened next, Eileen gave me a look I couldn't read. Some folks said she left on the night bus. Others said she never made it out of town. Then she leaned closer. If you're serious about finding her, you should talk to Harold at the bait shop. He was the last one to see her alive. The bait shop was only a short walk from the diner, but it felt like I was crossing into another world, the kind that smells like minnows, motor oil, and decades of cigarette smoke. Behind the counter stood a man who looked like the decades had weathered him the same way they had the wooden docks outside. His eyes were sharp, though too sharp for someone pretending not to know why I was there. "You Harold?" I asked. "Who's a skin?" I slid one of the Polaroids onto the counter, the one where Claire's reflection was clearest. "Eileen said you might remember her." He stared at it for a long moment, then let out a sound somewhere between a sigh and a grunt. "Yeah, I remember. That girl was in trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Harold leaned back on his stool, as if deciding whether to tell me anything at all. "She came in here late one afternoon, bought a pack of smokes and a map of Ontario. Asked me how far she could get without crossing the border. Kept glancing over her shoulder like someone was watching the... Did you see anyone following her?" "Not right then. But later that night I saw a black Buick pull into the motel across the street. Out-of-state plates. 2 men inside." My stomach tightened. "And Claire?" "She came out of her room just before midnight, carrying nothing but that camera. Walked down toward the lake. I figured she was just clearing her head. But when I went to open up shop in the morning, her room door was still open, lights still on. No sign of her anywhere." He slid the Polaroid back toward me, his voice low. "If you're smart, you'll leave it alone. Some things are buried for a reason." I wish I could say Harold's warning scared me into backing off. But the truth is, it had the opposite effect. Now I had to know. That night, I checked into the same motel Harold had mentioned, if you could call it a motel. The neon sign was missing letters, and the office was a cramped room with a bell that didn't work. My key was an actual metal key, attached to a block of plastic that probably hadn't been updated since Reagan was in office. I took the same room number Harold had described. Inside, the carpet smelled faintly of mildew, and the wallpaper was peeling in the corners. But it wasn't the smell or the walls that made my chest tighten, it was the view from the window. Straight down the gravel path to the lake. The same path Claire had walked. I couldn't sleep, so I sat at the small desk by the window, just staring out at the moonlit shoreline. Around 1 a.m. I saw something move, a figure at the edge of the trees. Tall, wearing a long coat. Standing perfectly still. I froze. After a minute, they turned and disappeared into the woods. The next morning, I went to check the shoreline myself. There, wedged between 2 rocks just where the gravel path met the sand, was a small rusted tin box. Inside, wrapped in layers of wax paper, was a roll of undeveloped 35mm film. I knew right then, if I could get those pictures developed, I might finally know what happened to Claire. The question was, who could I trust to do it? There aren't many places left that still develop film, but I remembered a tiny photography shop 2 towns over, the kind with dusty frames in the window and a faded Kodak sign hanging by one rusty chain. When I walked in, the smell hit me first, a mix of photochemicals and old wood. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 60s with round glasses and a calm, knowing smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. I placed the tin box on the counter and carefully unwrapped the film. "I found this near the lake. Think you can bring it back to life?" She held it up to the light, inspecting it like a jeweler would a rare gem. "It's old, but not too far gone. Might take a few hours." I killed time wandering around the town, an old record store, a thrift shop with VHS tapes piled to the ceiling, a cafe that still served coffee in thick ceramic mugs instead of paper cups. All the while I kept glancing at my watch. When I finally walked back into the shop, the woman had an envelope waiting. "Some of the shots were damaged," she said softly, "but you'll want to see these." I pulled the photos out right there at the counter. The first few were nothing, blurry trees, a half-sunken dock, a close-up of someone's hand. But then, Claire. Standing on the lakeshore looking directly into the camera. Her expression was tense, almost fearful. The next photo, she wasn't alone anymore. A man stood beside her. Tall. Wearing a dark coat. His hand was gripping her elbow. And then the last picture froze my blood. It was Claire again, but this time she wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking past it. Over the photographer's shoulder. And whatever she saw, it terrified her. I couldn't stop staring at that last photo. The fear in Claire's eyes wasn't just surprise, it was recognition. She knew whoever was behind that camera. I asked the shop owner if she remembered who might have been shooting film at the lake back then. She shook her head, but after a pause said, "I know someone who might." Name's Pete Lambert. Used to shoot weddings, town events, and he loved that lake. Pete turned out to be in his 70s, living in a small bungalow a few miles out of town. He answered the door in paint-stained overalls, looking at me like I'd interrupted a masterpiece. When I showed him the photos, his face changed instantly. His eyes narrowed and he handed the prints back without a word. "You took these, didn't you?" I pressed. Pete sighed. "Not all of them. Just the first two. The ones where she's alone, and then with the man. After that, I heard something in the woods. Thought it was a deer. But when I lowered my camera, there was someone else there. He told me to leave. Said if I valued my neck, I'd forget what I saw." "Who was he?" I asked. Pete hesitated. "All I know is he wasn't local. Drove a black '78 Pontiac with no plates. And the girl, Claire, she looked like she was trying to say something to me without speaking." I leaned forward. "What happened after you left?" "That roll? I thought I lost it. Guess he didn't realize it was still in my backup camera. But if you found it by the lake, that means someone put it there. Recently." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just some forgotten mystery. Someone was trying to send me a message. Driving back from Pete's, the envelope of photos sat on the passenger seat, like a silent passenger judging me for not understanding the whole story yet. But one thought kept looping in my mind: if that film had been placed by the lake recently, someone knew I'd find it. And who else would care enough to make sure I did, except Claire herself? The problem was Claire had been gone for 32 years. No body ever found, no official closure. Just a police file stamped missing and a whole lot of small-town whispers. That night, I spread the photos across my kitchen table. I noticed something I'd missed earlier. In the corner of the last picture, just behind Claire's shoulder, there was a blurred reflection in the lake. It was small, distorted, but looked a lot like the photographer's own silhouette. Pete swore he wasn't there for that last shot. So who was? I zoomed in on my phone, adjusting the contrast until the figure became clearer. The shape of the shoulders, the way the head tilted, it was oddly familiar. My chest tightened. I had seen that posture before. In an old yearbook photo. Claire's older sister, Margaret. Margaret had moved away in 1991, supposedly to start fresh in Chicago. No one in town had heard from her in decades. And now, she might have been the one holding the camera in the last known image of Claire. Chicago felt like another planet compared to the slow heartbeat of my hometown. The streets were loud, impatient, and smelling of exhaust and food carts. I had an address for Margaret from a phone directory that looked about 15 years out of date. The building was a faded brick walk-up on the west side, the kind where the buzzer doesn't work and the hall smells faintly of cigarette smoke and fried onions. I knocked. No answer. Knocked again, harder. Finally, the door opened just a crack. A pair of sharp blue eyes stared at me from the shadows. "What do you want?" "Margaret," I asked. "I'm here about Claire." Her face tightened, like I'd used a word she hadn't heard in years but instantly recognized. She stepped back, opening the door wider. Inside, her apartment was cluttered with old books, mismatched chairs, and a faint scent of lavender. "I know who you are," she said, settling into an armchair. "You're from the lake town. You found something, didn't you?" I placed the envelope of photos on the table between us. Margaret looked at them for a long time before speaking. "I took that last picture," she said quietly. "But not for the reason you think." Margaret poured 2 glasses of water, her hands trembling slightly. "Claire wasn't kidnapped," she began. "Not in the way everyone thinks. She left." I frowned. Then why the secrecy? The fear in her eyes. She was running from someone, but not the man in the photo. He was trying to help her. His name was Daniel. They were planning to leave together. But the night before, she came to me, said she'd overheard something. That Daniel wasn't who he said he was. Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. She told me there was a second man, the one in the woods. And she thought he was connected to something dangerous. She said if anything happened to her, I should keep the photos safe and someday give them to someone who'd understand. "Why me?" I asked. Margaret gave me a small, sad smile. "Because you're his son." It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "His son?" Margaret nodded. "Daniel left town right after Claire disappeared. No one knew where he went. But a few months later he sent me a letter. He said he'd met someone, started a family. He never mentioned names, but I recognized you when I saw you years later visiting the lake with your parents. You have his eyes." I sat there, stunned, piecing together the impossible. My father, Daniel, the man in the photograph, had been part of Claire's escape. And whatever went wrong that day was the reason she vanished. Where is she now? I asked, my voice unsteady. Margaret looked down. I don't know. She called me once, maybe 10 years ago. Said she was safe, living under a different name. But she wouldn't tell me where. I left Chicago with the photos tucked safely in my bag, my head buzzing with more answers than I knew what to do with. Back home, I dug through my father's old belongings. In a cigar box at the back of his closet, I found it, a faded postcard of a seaside town, no return address, just a single line in careful handwriting. Tell the boy I'm proud of him. The date on the card was 3 years ago. I don't know if I'll ever find Claire. Maybe she doesn't want to be found. But I do know this. The lake isn't just a place from my childhood anymore. It's the place where 3 lives tangled together and changed forever. And every summer, when I walk its shore, I half expect to see her, older now, maybe with silver in her hair, watching from the trees, making sure the past stays where it belongs.